being somewhat informal, right, John?
Yes.
So we have a couple of things that John and I are going to start with in terms of things that we've learned. And then we really were hoping to have a conversation with all of you.
Okay, so some of the things I learned, that back channel chat can be really effective in a large class. This is something I had tried to do in my large class in Lanigan, but it was impossible to do without having another monitor, which we finally got, and then we've shut down and moved away. But it has been really effective when I was teaching a class of, I think it was about 289 students last fall. Having that back channel work really well. Eventually, once we had the ability to basically lock down the student names so that they weren't changing them, because it turns out freshmen can be sophomoric when they're able to come in under different names and make up some names and have a little bit of fun by trying to be disruptive. But once students had to be logged in and connected, that problem went away and it became incredibly effective, where that discussion that went on in the back channel after a week or two became a really good source of questioning and interaction, even in a much larger class than I thought it would work in general. Another issue that I certainly notice, and I think we all have, is that while we've all been aware of some of the inequities that our students face, it became so much more obvious when we saw the students at home struggling to connect on smartphones or on 7 or 8-year-old computers, or on in a room where they're crowded with lots of other people, or where their work hours suddenly changed, or where they were taking care of engaged in healthcare or other types of aid for family members that were ill. And while we knew all of that, much of that has been hidden in person, and it became, I'm hoping it becomes much harder for all of us, including myself, to forget as we move forward, because those disparities in resources are covered up when we're in college, but those disparities were there all the way through those students' education until they got to us, which has put many of our students at quite a bit of a disadvantage in terms of the support they've had along their educational journey. I think we've all noticed just how important human connections are in teaching, that I think many of us didn't understand just how important or how much energy we got from being in a classroom environment and interacting with each other. And I think we felt that ourselves. And we also saw that in our students who ended up really enjoying the opportunities to work together. One of the things Rebecca and I have talked about is that in the past, whenever I've done at least group work, students would often complain about it and they tended to hate group work. Now, during the pandemic year of teaching, students tended to love group work because they got to engage with other students more intensively. They got to get to know each other much more effectively than they did in other types of engagement, because they were missing all of that. And those connections seem to be really important. We saw a lot of students fading out if they weren't engaged in class, where students would be on Zoom, but just gradually disappear. They'd stop turning in assignments. And I think a lot of it is just lost those connections to other people in the room, in the virtual room, and so forth. In the classes that I taught where there were more connections, where students seemed to get to know each other better, I didn't see that. But in classes where those connections just didn't form, no matter what I tried doing, I ended up seeing a lot more students fading away and disappearing. I've, for the first time, tried embedding some questions in videos, and that was really helpful in a couple of ways. One is I provided videos from most of my classes, at least the introductory and intermediate levels, for about 25 years or more now. But the only students who tended to watch them were the students who were doing really well and just wanted to make sure they locked in A, or they didn't want to get stuck with an A- or something similar. The students who could have benefited the most tended not to view them until eventually, if they were really struggling, they might. But no matter how much suggestion I provided, just embedding some questions in those videos and assigning a trivial share of the grade to them and letting them watch them and take those questions over and over again has led to a dramatic use in the number of views of the videos. And students have in general commented that they found them really helpful because they actually watched them this time, and keeping them short and so forth makes it more likely that they'll actually use them. The classes that I taught that was most effective was a capstone course, where it worked at least as well as any capstone course I taught before. But I think a large part of that was I gave students more agency and more of a role in setting up the syllabus, choosing the direction of the course, choosing the types of assessment they'd use, choosing the types of activities they'd engage in. There was some learning objectives that had to be met, but giving them more say about how we met those ended up resulting in a much more positive atmosphere in the class, and a very successful class, and a class that was at least as successful as it ever had been in a face-to-face format. On the other side of this, I've been aware of the problem with academic dishonesty associated with Study Blue and Chegg and all the and Course Hero and so forth. And I had been monitoring that. That broke down a little bit when we went remote because I was pretty busy, tied up in providing support for faculty and doing workshops. And I didn't check that as actively. And then this semester, when I went back to use some of those low stakes quizzes, I found that beginning by mid to late March, well, by late March, every single question that I had given to students as a practice question, and there were thousands of them, ended up being posted there with solutions. So I was amazed at just how much academic dishonesty was occurring with the shift to online. And we know that Chegg use has more than doubled, and it's becoming pretty much of a separate epidemic on our campus as well as throughout higher ed. And the way you can check it, I mean, you can just basically grab any question that you have in any format that students can respond to online. Just do a Google search for it, and you'll find the actual question there along with the answers. And what students will generally do is they have the smartphone app, they pay $16 a month for Chegg. They just take a picture of the image on the screen, and then they upload it, it transcribes it, and makes it accessible. Well, they essentially OCRs it, and then they provide answers for any number of questions that students pose for $16 a month. And Chegg is really good. And if once they see that people from the same class have searched for multiple things, it will say, you search for this question, you might also be interested in this question. So I was able, on one quiz where there were about 300 questions potentially that students could get in clusters of 25, it went through like dozens and dozens of questions, all of which were ones I had written in the last year or two. And that made it really challenging because students were just looking up all the low stakes questions, which are only like 10, 15% of the grade, depending on the class. But when they got to other types of assessments where they couldn't do that, they tried to do it in almost every class, but when it was harder to do that, then they didn't do so well. So it's a major issue that I think we need to address. There's a lot of ways of addressing it. We could talk to our students. That was something that was suggested in a workshop we did in a podcast we did last week. You can do other things. One of the things I ended up doing is saying, if you post anything to Chegg, you failed the class. And that by itself is a really negative tone and one I hated to use, but it did shut it down this semester. And actually last semester too, I didn't have a single case of any new questions being uploaded, even with 289 questions. But last spring, after the pandemic hit, even discussion prompts were uploaded where students were asked to do some reading and address some issues in their discussion. So that was a really major challenge. It's dramatically increased my workload, and it's taken away all the benefits from retrieval practice for those students who were just cheating through it. One of the students, because I was able to track who did it last year, although I didn't discover it until this year, one of the students I talked to graduated from honors from one of our schools here and noted that she had done this in all of her classes while she had been at Oswego because she wasn't that confident in her ability, but basically she cheated away to, graduation with honors, which is something that, is less than ideal because the students are cheating themselves and, not getting the benefits from all the work we put into giving them low stakes assessments, mastery quizzing, and so on. I've been amazed at how useful breakout rooms can be in terms of allowing small group activities. However, they do add a little bit of an overhead and make and limit the number of active learning activities you can do in small groups in a large class in ways that might not occur in the same way in the classroom, where you can more easily judge and observe when students are finished and when you can assist students more easily. I know there are ways of doing it, and we presented workshops on that, but it just took longer to do anything in a breakout room than it would have in a classroom, where you can listen to the sound of people and wander around the classroom and see how the groups are doing. You can jump from breakout room to breakout room, but there's that time delay. So I ended up doing a little bit less or fewer activities, although maybe I chose them more carefully because of that. But one of the things that really struck me about the whole pandemic is that I think we all learned a lot from each other. That I've learned a lot from some things that people have presented in workshops. And I know people have talked about the things they've learned from each other. And that's not something we do often enough. And I'm hoping that we get back to doing that, we continue to do more of that once we have a chance to rest this summer, because it really could make our work easier. And in departments where there's multiple sections of courses, it would be really nice. And I've been advocating this in my own department unsuccessfully for about 20 some years now, that it would be really nice if we all work together in creating some learning materials that could be shared across all of our classes. Everyone works alone in the silos. But I think, if we shared some of the work, it could make the workload easier for all of us. That's what I've got.
So I agree with most of what John said. I don't have large classes, so I can't attest any of those. But I certainly had many of those same lessons as well. Some other things that I definitely took away from the past year, and I didn't have the emergency remote learning. I wasn't teaching that semester, so I didn't have that experience. So my lessons have all been from that already happened. And so just from the last academic year. So nothing from March 2020 or that semester. So one is really leveraging the LMS and the idea that we have a learning management system, really using the assignments and the features that are built in. Rather than using alternatives. I historically used a website for my class because I teach web design. I was trying to model web design, et cetera, and Blackboard definitely doesn't do that. However, it does make some teaching and learning things a little bit more efficient. Not as efficient as I would like, but it is a learning management system. So it has some of the kinds of features that a website doesn't have. That you can take advantage of. So taking advantage of the LMS can be good for the students, and it can also be good for the faculty member. I also started doing kind of daily warm up or transition activities. I was teaching 3-hour studio classes that meet 2 times a week, right? So 3 hours in Zoom sounds real horrible. I don't know. I don't know how you feel about it, but I think it sounds terrible, right? So I was trying to really switch up the kinds of activities, make sure we had time that we weren't on screen, doing things in breakout rooms, doing things in big groups, taking breaks, the whole, really trying to be intentional about it, but also just trying to make sure that you switch from one Zoom meeting to the next Zoom meeting. And, when you're switching classes, you might walk from one end of campus to another. You kind of have a way to kind of transition your mind a little bit. To a new space or a new thing, or just kind of move your body a little bit and have some interactivity. So I started just doing intentional kind of creative warm-ups. Sometimes I was using virtual whiteboards a lot for that kind of activity. So maybe it was a drawing activity or a game or music or what have you, but just kind of being intentional about those beginning moments of class. Certainly you can have the kind of chat time, you get there early, leave late kind of strategy, which you might do in a physical classroom as well. But I found I'm introverted. I find structure really helpful. And so having an activity in which to kind of engage, to kind of make that transition or make those connections happen worked really well for me. And I also took a writing class recently that had that in it, and I found it incredibly useful. I couldn't believe how actually helpful that was in getting me in the zone to really get the most out of a session each time. I also just noted, the whiteboards, but I did a lot of activities that allowed people to really participate and have a voice in a conversation without ever having to unmute, right? So I was teaching mostly synchronous online classes. I had a lot of students that, for whatever reason, chose not to turn on their cameras or microphones a lot of the time. For many of them, it's because they were just using their phone and it was hard to switch between that and chat and some other things. There was some of that going on. I taught morning classes. There was some of that going on. If I did small groups, they tend to turn on their cameras and stuff more often. But in the whiteboards, people were really active. I could see their mouses moving around and them really contributing. They were also using the chat. So they were using these like non-vocal ways to participate and contribute that I found really valuable. And I don't want to lose that, because I think that often happens in class as well. They don't want to speak up for whatever reason, and having a different way to voice or be a participant was important. I also really was very intentional in the past year about incorporating in reflection as a way to kind of critically think about their learning. Although I had reflection activities and things before, I don't think I ever gave them enough time or weight for like what they really were. A lot of times these are like where the learning was actually occurring in the activities we were doing in class. You do some skill building, but it's like, what did I just do and why did I do it? Right? Like wasn't happening unless you were kind of intentionally providing those prompts in that kind of graded assignment. So I ended up doing kind of pretty regular reflections in all of my classes that were kind of graded assignments, easy to grade assignments, but really specific. So not just like descriptions of what they did, but pretty important criteria about making their kind of thinking visible to themselves and to me and some other things. So it wasn't the kind of reflection they were used to doing, which they, describe what they did and call it done. Like I was actually really asking them to really reflect, and they didn't get credit unless they really did that. So there was a little learning curve for them there. But once we got that kind of pattern established, I think it was really useful to students. And I also did this with groups. So I had persistent teams throughout the semester, and I did reflection activities with them as well. I also used a lot of rubrics, which I finally hit at the right level of specificity. So that was really helpful. And making sure that students knew where they were. I also started paying more attention to making assignments that required being off the screen and not on a computer. I teach design. I teach mostly like web design and interaction design, which is a lot of computer work. So I tried to find a lot of ways for them to not be on the computer as much, which they all found very refreshing. So I did things like some podcasts, drawing that was like not on the screen, and some other things that I think were really valuable, and I don't want to lose those. In fact, I was brainstorming earlier for my fall classes about additional things I could do and be really intentional about not being in the classroom, maybe going outside and doing some other things. I also spent a lot of time checking in about health and well-being at the starts of classes, and that proved to be really useful to the students, but also useful for me to kind of gauge what to do. Sometimes I really backed off on stuff. We eliminated a couple of assignments because we just all kind of needed it. But they all really appreciated it. I got a lot of feedback throughout the semester that no one else was asking them how they were and taking the time. And I also, which I found surprising, but like I had students say that. And then, I also did things like little surveys, like ranking about like kind of where we're at. Do we feel like we're totally sinking and drowning? Do we feel like we're thriving? And I was really surprised at how low those were kind of consistently throughout the semester. So we took the time to kind of talk about those results collectively. And I shared resources about kind of the counseling center and a wide variety of other things, which I think students found helpful. And then finally, one of maybe my biggest lessons is that I teach a lot of technical stuff. And so sometimes the pace is too quick for some folks, right? At the pace I was teaching it at. And I really was trying to find some flexibility. So I found some ways of doing some flipped classroom materials that allowed students to be working on what they needed to be working on in class based on where they were at, and not judging where they were at, and allowing them to work with other students who were also in the same place at the same time. So that was important. And yeah, John's putting the sinking feeling definitely got worse over the missed break. I agree. We had a really intense conversation like the week that spring break would have been. And like everyone was just really exhausted. So that's important to think about. And so that flexibility thing, even around the mental health stuff, became really important too, because maybe it was a point where like people just needed to be out off the computer. They just needed to take a break. And I tried to build in as much flexibility in my scheduling as possible. So maybe there was assignments and things that we had for the week, but they had all week to do them, right? They weren't due like periodically throughout the week. They were due, in a week's time. And we had class time to work on it, which is a studio model, right? Like we're in class more often. So we're spending time in class doing things. But rather than saying like exercise 1 needs to be due by Wednesday, I would say, all right, these are the exercises this week. If you're still working on it and need help on exercise 1 on Wednesday, like I can help you in class on Wednesday, and then you can move on to exercise 2 when you're ready for it. And I kind of put them in little learning groups related to that. And that was incredibly helpful and maybe should have been obvious to me previously, but like finding the exact method of doing that wasn't so obvious in the past.